So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do we agree that corruption is a bad thing? Can you show some cards? Lots agreeing, great. So I'm going to try and put it on trial. You'd think that would be a really easy thing to do. You've already given your verdict. It's harder than you think because actually, even though the UN has had a convention against corruption since 2003, there's actually no definition. So they very helpfully give us this 8 pages of definitions, and almost every page says, well, but it depends. So things like improper political contributions. I give you cash, you give me a peerage, improper political contribution. The banking industry lobby gives your political party cash, and that question of caps on bankers' bonuses never quite comes up in parliamentary session. Improper, not illegal, never really sure. Now, I'm going to talk about this in the context of Indonesia, which is a country that is good at some things and bad at other things. One thing it's very good at is the labor-saving device of the acronym. So they have reduced all of these 8 pages to 3 letters, KKN, which stands for korupsi, kolusi, dan nepotisme. And I don't think I need to translate that. Indonesians are shit at sport. It's the 4th most populous nation on the planet. There are 250 million Indonesians, and 22 of them came to represent their nation at the London Olympics. And a handful of those were disqualified for cheating. Now, one of the running jokes in Indonesia is, why isn't there a World Cup for corruption? Because then at least we'd win something. And they have won the World Cup for corruption. So Transparency International gave the former president Suharto, who ruled for 32 years until 1998, the dubious title of all-time most corrupt person. And it's very fashionable to diss him. But I actually am going to argue that corruption in Indonesia has been useful and necessary. So Suharto was ruling this nation, which if you put Aceh up here where London is, and you pass through 13,568 islands, and 300 ethnic groups, 700 languages, etc., you come down to the equivalent of where Tehran is. So it's a very, very difficult thing to hold together. And when Suharto came to power in the mid-60s, the country was in chaos. Now, it was formerly a Dutch colony, and Indonesians fought a 4-year war against the Dutch, who tried to come back in after the Second World War, after they'd been ousted by the Japanese. And what happened then was that the military, because there was no state, so there was no power to raise taxes, there was no power to actually fund this war against the Dutch, they allowed the military commanders to essentially do their own thing. You raise your money however you can, as long as you run your war. When Suharto came to power, he essentially kept that model going. So when I was working for the Indonesian Ministry of Health in the early 2000s, I got a note. I was working on HIV. And I got a note from the guy who was the head of the World Bank at the time in Indonesia, who rejoiced in the name of David Dollar, not making it up, saying, we're making some briefing notes for the incoming government, and what's your top tip in your field for the government policy tip? And I said, triple the military budget. And he wrote back and said, no, I meant in your field, in HIV. And I said, triple the military budget. Why? Because HIV in Indonesia is driven by drug injection. Now, the military had been using this off-budget model all through the Suharto years. So yes, very, very corrupt this time. The military had access to all of the contracts, all of the monopolies. They ran logging, they ran the oil industry, they ran mining. Very, very corrupt. But the understanding there was that they had to deliver security to the nation. They had to deliver security to the nation out of their own pockets, out of the rest, what's left over, yeah, they can stash in a bank account in Singapore, no one's asking any questions. But first, deliver the goods. At Reformasi, after Suharto fell, the first order of business among the reformers, including a lot of well-meaning foreign governance specialists, was got to get the military out of business. And they did get the military out of business. But they didn't increase their budget. There was never more than a third of the military budget on budget. So the military has to make up this spending from somewhere. They can't do it from legitimate businesses anymore. So what are they doing? I'm mapping my drug users around the country, and I'm such a dinosaur. Years and years ago, I was a journalist in Indonesia, way before this, and I look at this and I think, looks just like a map of military installations across Indonesia. So, gosh, we've got heroin use popping up across Indonesia, exactly where the military installations are. Funny that. So we hadn't thought about the function that corruption was performing, and it was performing a real and necessary function. We cut it out, and guess what? We had a worse outcome. Now Indonesia has decentralized hugely, and so what we have are these local elections, 509 separate districts, each with their locally elected head. And each of them are, so this says, stop money politics, and you can see the candidate for local head has 100,000 rupiah notes floating out of his pocket for vote buying. Now, vote buying is illegal in Indonesia, as it's illegal everywhere else in the world. But does it really have the same function as giving someone cash in this country would, asking them for their vote? I would argue not. I'm going to show you a little video from North Sumatra. So these are the offerings of rice. This is at a ceremony moving someone's bones. Then we've got the offering of cloth. And you've even got all the local worthies, the local nuns, you've got the local military employees. Now we've got the cash offerings. More cash. Everyone's involved in this great network of patronage. This is a similar, also from the Batak group. This guy is quite a mate of mine. He's a senior police officer, and he's giving out 2,000 rupiah notes to kids as part of a cultural ceremony. So this is just part of the way that ceremonies happen in many parts of Indonesia. So when it comes to the great festival of democracy and all the candidates go around giving out cash, no one really thinks of it in the same way as they think of vote buying in countries such as this one. It's not strictly true that no one does. Some people are disappointed. This guy is from the PKS party, which is modeled on the Muslim Brotherhood and is the closest thing in Indonesia to an Islamist party. And he thinks that they should clean up the system. He's actually suing people. He's trying to sue people because he bought their votes and then he didn't get any votes. So he's trying to get his money back. Now, a lot of people say that corruption kind of undermines our social compact, that it undermines the shared values that make society work. But I think that in some places it actually is the shared values that make society work. So I'm going to talk about Kapuas Hulu, which is up here in central Kalimantan, in West Kalimantan. And I was up there. It's about 3 hours up the river from the nearest road. And I'm talking to this guy who's setting out his fish traps. And I say, so how's life? And he said, oh, it's fine, except, God, I've got such a headache with the World Bank. I was like, okay. Well, it turns out that he's the local village head, and he administers a program called Raskin, which is a social protection program which gives rice, subsidized rice, to 17 million poor families in Indonesia. And he said, you know, I went to the trainings, and I've read the manuals, and I've been through the evaluations, and it tells me that I'm supposed to give the rice to this one and not to that one. The ones that have poor cards, I'm supposed to give it to. This is a village that has no electricity, that has no road access, that has no anything. Everyone's pretty poor, but he's supposed to give it to this one and not that one. But in my culture, he says, something comes free from the government, I have to give it equally to everyone. Everyone wants that, including the poor families. So he says, if I give it only to the people who are supposed to get it, then I please the World Bank, but I piss off my constituency. If I give it to the people, if I go with my constituency, the World Bank says I'm corrupt. Now, I would argue that, yes, you could say, well, it's taking something away from poor people who deserve it. Only 25% of Raskin actually goes to the poorest people, mostly because of things like that. So the World Bank throws up its hands and says, corruption, corruption. But actually, what's happening here? Well, the day I was talking to him, that night, there was a kid in the village who had an epileptic seizure. And they came to me and said, oh, you're the doctor, which I'm not. And, what should we do? What should we do? And I said, well, the kid actually has to get to a hospital. And the hospital is 3 hours by boat and then 2 hours by non-tarmacked road away. And that's an expensive business at in the low season because you have to charter a boat and this and that. And I said, but I'm going tomorrow morning, so I'll take the kid. And there was a big kind of compact. And I woke up at 5:30 the next morning. The kid had already left. The rich families, those ones who shouldn't be getting the rice but are, have paid for the kid to get to hospital. So the function of corruption in that case is basically to maintain social cohesion. And I would say it's working. You can call that patronage, you can call it corruption, or you could call it the big society. And the big society is basically supposed to step in and deliver when governments are not delivering the services that are expected of them. And sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't. And in this country, it's not going so well. So I would say that actually the difference between the big society in Indonesia and the big society in the UK is that those patronage networks in Indonesia are actually delivering to a majority of the people. Those corrupt networks are actually, we've got trickle-down corruption, distributive corruption, rather than extractive corruption. In Indonesia, the electorate is incredibly sophisticated and they understand very, very well the difference between those two things. And if a local politician takes money from the hospital budget and goes to Singapore and buys methamphetamine and spends the weekend taking drugs with hookers in a hotel room, pays for it he'll get thrown out in a nanosecond. The electorate will punish that kind of corruption in a nanosecond, but they will not punish the sort of corruption that is distributive. Now, I want to give you one very quick example from Aceh in the far west of Indonesia. And you've all heard of Aceh because in 2004 there was a tsunami there. Did any of you give money to the tsunami victims in 2004? That's pretty pathetic. Really? Wow. 190,000 people in Aceh died. And there was, this was the devastation. Now, something you might not know about Aceh is that there has been a civil war, and there had been a civil war running on and off for 30 years at the time of the tsunami. And when the tsunami came along, it flattened everything except the mosques. The people of Aceh said, this is a sign that God wants us to stop fighting. I personally think it's a sign that contractors are less likely to cheat on building materials when they build a mosque than when they build a school, but never mind. So there was a sort of a compact made between the separatists and the government. But essentially what happened was that $7 billion of aid that came in, the second tsunami, which was a tsunami of funding. How many of you gave to it again? $7 billion of aid, actually about 40% of it went through means that are not entirely legal into the pockets of the separatists. So that money bought the peace. Now, you could shake your head at that and say, tut, tut, our money was used to support dodgy characters and former combatants. But I would say that actually that has delivered peace to a province that has been at war for 30 years. Is that a bad thing? I want to finish with an example from another country. So, Abraham Lincoln here, you think of as a great statesman, and one of the greatest things that he did was what? The 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which wiped out slavery. And how did he achieve that? Bribery, patronage. He more or less threatened people who didn't come into line. He used every trick in the book that are in that 8 pages of definitions to achieve something that was ultimately for a great purpose, I would argue. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I would put to you the fact that I don't think that corruption deserves a death sentence quite yet. I think that what we need to do is to think much more carefully about the role that corruption plays, the function that it's playing, and see how we can replace that with something that's less corrupt. We need to prosecute the bad, the extractive, the giving to the already haves type of corruption incredibly vigorously. But the other big society type corruption, which is actually delivering through networks to the people who have less in society, we need to rename and promote. Thank you.